Welcome to Prime Suspects for your weekly insider's look behind the counter of Prime Sports. Alongside Adam Bjorn and only Adam Bjorn, Joe Brennan Jr. on short-term IR this week. I'm your host, Matt Landis. Hot on the heels of yesterday's Sports Equinox, our one day this year with Major League Baseball and the NFL, NBA, and NHL all in action. This week's rundown brings all four of the major U.S. pro sports leagues front and center. Adam, to get the ball rolling, what's it like for you and your team behind the scenes to gear up for a betting board as jam-packed as a Sports Equinox?
Well, oddly enough, it's, only 20 or so games. It's a lot less than a normal college Saturday or a college basketball Saturday or something like that. But you've literally got, I think it's like 20, 21 games, 2 or 3 hour kickoff time period. And obviously all the four major US sports. Thursday night football with game 3 of the World Series pretty much kicking off within 10 minutes of each other. It's Dodgers, Yankees, as big as they come, I guess, in the baseball side of it. So it'll be interesting who bothers to tune in for the Steelers Giants on that Thursday night. But yeah, NBA back, NHL back. It's the beginning of the grind, because once you get NBA and you get NHL and college basketball's right there, still got college football and NFL still rolling through. It's a hectic few months ahead.
And we'll peel back the curtain a little bit. You alluded to it. We still don't know how things will stack up on the Sports Equinox because we are indeed recording this a few days prior to it. So just want to set that out there as groundwork for the duration of this conversation for the audience hearing this the day after our 2024 Sports Equinox. And Adam, you referenced the World Series about as big as it gets with this Yankees-Dodgers Fall Classic upon us. Joe had mentioned on our show 2 weeks ago that a Yankees-Dodgers matchup would be the best for the book in terms of handle. No surprise there, but how would you say that's tracking with what you're seeing so far?
Well, so far it's been fairly balanced action. Again, I think there's East versus West. There's, the old school sort of knowing what these two kind of teams and the historical aspect of it. Again, as a non-American, I'm fully aware of these two teams and the way that sort of had a history between them and whatnot. So it's more of just, I think you get a generic interest in a series that is a baseball series rather than a team series. You get a Houston or you get a San Francisco or that, you're really getting those teams, those followers. Whereas this is, I guess, a true baseball series, true baseball World Series playoff that the average or the historic baseball bettor will tune into just to see, how it plays out.
Yeah, you touched on it being uncertain how things will stack up with the World Series going toe-to-toe with that Steelers-Giants Monday night game alongside World Series Game 3 at Yankee Stadium. And I guess let's use that as a bridge into the NFL portion of this conversation, because as baseball season nears its finish line, the NFL season is approaching the midway point. Adam, 2 common refrains during our weekly football recaps since the season began. 1, winning in New Jersey, losing in Ohio. And 2, pregame hold looking good, in-game hold looking not so good. And this may be an oversimplification, so maybe we can peel back the curtain a bit as far as these 2 topics are concerned. Starting with the disparate results you've been seeing by state in the NFL so far this season, how would you describe what's working in New Jersey that isn't working in Ohio?
Well, I really honestly believe that the arbitrage business is what ultimately is helping us in New Jersey. We definitely have been very welcoming to those type of players, which aren't welcomed much where else. They're obviously needing that second out to be able to play into that. I know Sport Trade has been a big key to that whole progress of, 2 books in one state that welcome those type of bettors. Sport Trade obviously needing volume to be successful. Us understanding that liquidity obviously helps us win the day out. Our market makers per se as bookmakers taking the bets, Sport Trade's market makers, whoever they may be in the world, sort of feeding into that aspect. And then I know there's definitely some others that can still slide into a FanDuel or a DraftKings or a Caesars and Fanatics and these other ones that have come on board as well to be able to maximize that. Whereas Ohio, we had a really good 1 week about a month ago on the live when I believe it was the 49ers got a lead against Arizona and then ended up getting beat. And that sort of is that dynamic of favorites getting up, people thinking it's easy money by that stage, better than bank interest, we call it. And then that sort of turning around and catching them. That player in particular has just gone on a stormy run since then and gotten all that back and that. So it's really, I believe, the tale of two worlds of, we need to go find more arbitrages in Ohio, but who do they put on that other side? Because there's no sport trade. So it's sort of that dynamic of working out what the lay of the land is. With Kentucky potentially on deck, we have a circa there, no sport trade, but Arizona that we're talking about has a sport trade and a circa right across the border. So I think there's some dynamic to sort of the niche that we're trying to tap into there, as well as really digging in and understanding what's happening in Ohio.
So it sounds like arbitrage may be a linchpin here, but beyond that, how would you describe your vision to continue building on positive momentum in New Jersey and also starting to build some positive momentum in Ohio as well as other markets that may be right around the corner for Prime?
Honestly, no, I think our biggest weakness is obviously branding and marketing and getting ourselves out there. One, we don't have that big bankroll that we're pushing to have, thousands of dollars free that a lot of these other places have built their database off. We don't have the other aspect of being able to take other states that we have and sort of pushing it across borders and things like that to market across the country rather than just narrowly in the States. So now that we've started to sort of understand that a bit better, lean into it, look for people that have that skill set, bring them on board and sort of narrow down, if we do a radio run or something and we find a little town or somewhere reach or signups, then we should sort of tackle that and do it more of, I think the offshore, the unregulated market was really built as well with the Pied Pipers. So having that aspect of it, of inviting everybody to bet in, the Spankies, those kind of people of the world, knowing that we have the best bettors. And if you really want to earmark yourself as a professional bettor or that side of aspect as well, this is the place to do it. You can beat the other places, DraftKings, FanDuel, and that without much effort, in my opinion. Come along. You can take down a Circa or a Prime Sports. That's kind of the challenge of it. Then ultimately you have the nuts to be a successful sports bettor no matter where you are in the world against every operator.
And to your point about beating a book like Prime being a badge of honor among really sharp bettors, it sounds like it's maybe more feasible right now for people betting in-game than pre-game. So when it comes to what you're seeing on the hold side of things as the book, what would you say is driving the discrepancy between those positive pre-game results compared to the more negative skewing results from in-game bets?
Well, again, obviously the in-game numbers are weaker than the pre-game. The pre-games get fairly well set. They're very much the same number across the board. There's very little information that isn't put into that. So by the time you get to the game starting, the number's solid, the volume's there. Live betting is the weakness of the industry. If I'm sort of teaching anybody to get into it, why sit there all day long to go into the pre-game? Go do what you want to do in the daytime and then sit down at 7 p.m. Eastern and spend 3 or 4 hours picking off numbers live. Ultimately, that's where there's inefficiencies and it's harder for the operators to see as well. So yes, it's more work. It's harder to build live models, having the data, and there's other aspects to it. But if you're really going to spend the time and effort and go that extra length, going into those inefficient markets is obviously where you target. We understand that. We know that. We're always trying to make them better. But ultimately, it's the liquidity of trying to get, the more liquidity you get into it, the more efficient you can get. And then that sort of balances out over time. Right now, we need more players. We need more liquidity. And it's sort of just trying to find our way through it of what we need to do to get to that.
All right. Well, Adam, at this point, I'm going to keep us with the NFL, but flip it from a couple recurring themes on your side of the counter when it comes to discrepant results across markets and discrepant results looking at pregame versus in-game. I had a recent first-time experience as an NFL bettor. I'll lay it out and I'll be curious for your point of view. So I had a prop bet recently on a player's yardage over. When the game went final, he had gone over, according to NFL.com stats. Just one problem, some yardage was incorrectly credited to him. It was actually gained by a different player. And I was watching the game in real time, so I noted this. And in reality, the player I had bet finished under his yardage total. Bottom line here, the books where I bet this prop graded the over as a win per the official NFL stats. And the NFL went ahead and corrected this stat on a Monday night. The game was played on a Sunday in the early window, more than 24 hours later. Fortunately for me, the books where I made the bet kept it as a win. That's the luckiest victory I can fathom. So it's important to keep that in mind next time I may feel tempted to complain about a bad beat. But Adam, getting into a few questions to unpack this. If you're the bettor in this type of scenario and you know the wager has incorrectly been graded as a winner once the game goes final, how do you determine whether or not to flag this with a book?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I was actually expecting you to say that the books switched the result on you, which I would have had more of an opinion on that one. I'm glad they kept it as it was. However, a player, if they saw that on a Monday and then the Tuesday and they went and complained to gaming about it, it's an easy win for the player because there's the result. It's in black and white. So this is those are a particularly difficult one on the book, but it also shows, part of the NFL issues on their integrity of their data as well. So that could be calling them out. So does this scenario turn into people on Sunday got paid on the over, people on Monday go to gaming on Tuesday morning, all the players get paid potentially, or do you switch it when, again, if you had one of those misgradings, you're probably withdrawing Monday to make sure they can't get it back in case they try and flip it. And then being America, does that open up a lawsuit where the operator goes after the NFL for making a mistake in that situation as well? Depending on what the position is, I definitely would have wanted to keep the Sunday night result. However, probably would have paid out, the other side as well. Again, it's easy if you're riding little action versus millions of dollars on both sides and stuff like that, although I doubt it on props. But that's one where the opportunity for the book to just pay out everybody is there. Use it as an example, but also sort of highlight to the NFL, these sporting leagues want to be involved in this game. They want to get paid from this game. Then they need to get their data and their stats right and make sure that it's done in a timely manner, not 24 hours later. So that's definitely an interesting one. And that could spin off in multiple directions in how ultimately the operator plays it out. And then the players themselves. I mean, it's an easy win if they take that one to gaming post that Monday change.
Yeah, unfortunately, this case hasn't gotten too much noise. I think a big part of that is it did not involve very prominent players. But to your point about on the book side of things, looking to do the right thing, even if it means taking a bit of a hit on this specific wager. Also, from the bettor's perspective, if I'm thinking about doing the right thing and the concept of the bookie bettor relationship, on the bettor side of this, Adam, how beneficial should it be if a bettor were to flag this issue with the book in terms of potential longer term benefits such as limits and account longevity?
Well, I mean, that was highlighted on us the Sunday night after the game. You contact the book and you say, hey, I watched this game. I believe the stats are wrong. For us, that gets written in your account and there's definitely favors down the road of the good karma coming back kind of thing. But again, that's a difficult one. Even, myself, if I go back 20, 25 years, I was shafting the books however possibly I could. Those kind of mistakes I was taking advantage of. That was the nature of the beast back then. It took me probably 10 years to sort of play that bettor bookie relationship from the bettor side and sort of helping people out. And even till today, or, a lot of the books aren't around that were around then, but there were some that I would go after till the day that they either closed their doors or I stopped betting there. And there's others that I had a lot better relationship and would really help them out. Especially, again, I was in the offshore for a decade plus, and most of them really had trouble in understanding what they were doing and getting some of these results right, especially outside of the US day-to-day main scores, getting into the props or international sports. So you could really pick and choose who you aligned with, what were the ultimate books that you really needed, versus the one that if they shut you down, they were probably going to likely do it anyway at some point. So, hit them for what you can in the short term.
Yeah, and in the spirit of full disclosure, I did go ahead and flag this, and I like to think that that had something to do with integrity or doing the right thing. But I'd be lying to say that that longer term relationship, maybe getting some favors down the road, wasn't at least a substantial factor in that whole equation. Fortunately, it has remained a win anyway. And Adam, I'm wondering if it has remained graded as a win due to factors related to terms and conditions? I mean, if you're the book and you know the true outcome that transpired on the field, or one of your bettors, such as myself, has flagged the true outcome that transpired on the field, how should you grade the bet when the game goes final?
Well, that's the problem. A lot of the terms and conditions will say what website they're using as official. So you've either got to say, we're not grading this until tomorrow because we believe there's an issue and we're checking with the NFL whether that's true or not to see what happens. And that's probably really the only thing you can do if a player has flagged saying, I don't believe this is right. This is what I saw. You can probably go back. There's some companies that can go back to the replays. They have them through streaming or things like that where they can go through and calculate it and then again say, we're holding off on grading this. I don't think that's a big issue, especially when it can be highlighted that that's a potential problem. But if you don't pay people within a timely manner, they start to get a little nutty as well. So it goes into another one of how the rules are and the term conditions are across the board. I know tennis has been one for a very long time where there's been multiple different rules. It always used to be first serve. Then when there was a lot of fixing in the early 2000s, a lot of people went to full match. Then some rolled it back to first set. There's a variation there. The other one that's giving arbors a lot of problems right now is NASCAR. Some are doing, as the race finishes, they grade it on that result, and some are waiting for inspections. For me, those kind of events are, like horse races per se, of once it goes past the post, horse race disputes and disqualifications happen a lot quicker than the inspections in the NASCAR and F1. But it's once you get past the post, pay it out, and that's sort of the end of it. Whereas these ones that have now added due to one or two races where something happened where the winner was disqualified after inspection and there was a whole lot of hoopla, there's 40 races in a season, 38 of them are clean, and then maybe there's two that, have some issues after inspection, which just adds to the time of grading. The whole point of this is to get people's money back in play as quickly as possible. Hence why they created a product called cash outs, because as the operator, you just want the churn. You just want it to keep going around and around. So that's where, going back to the original one, if you get that word and you guys are smart enough, then they'll hold it off. But it's really hard, and they probably did the over, and then you wait and get those complaints the couple of days later. And a lot of books may pick and choose who they ultimately end up paying or just grade it differently. That's where, I think you've got to look at the better option of who the players were, who bet it, and I think ultimately if you didn't write much money on it, just pay them both.
One more slightly loose thread here I'd like to close with you. Something you alluded to earlier sparks the thought that this can get awfully complicated if bettors quickly withdraw their winnings or put it back in action on something else. But in a case like this, if the house rule is to abide by official NFL stats, what's your point of view, for the record, on potentially regrading that after the NFL does go ahead and revise its stats?
Well, again, if they went and graded it as an under like 2 days later, they have all the right to, because ultimately that's where, if it goes to gaming, and ultimately a lot of the decisions are based on if this goes to gaming, if this goes to the regulator, what's going to happen. So if that's changed Monday night, chances are Tuesday morning or even Monday night, the game can be regraded. Then you have to go in and look at how many accounts have gone into the negative, and generally you just make them whole and then sort of continue on in the world. If anyone complains, it says, well, I got paid Sunday night and now it's as a loser, will you send them to NFL.com and there it is. Like, there's not a lot a player can do about that in that situation, because ultimately it was graded correctly. So that's where the balance of how do you handle it. And yeah, at times it can get very complicated, and we see, a lot of headlines of paying things out early, and not so much in the US, but in the Europe, and that 20 years ago, there was one time I think Man United were paid out for the Premier League because they were so far in front. And there was an occasion where they actually got beat or run down, and then, they're paying out multiple winners. But a lot of that stuff is often gimmicky, because there's often not much of bottom line hurt if something sort of changes like that.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, somebody please fact check me on this if I'm wrong, but I feel like I remember in my earlier days as a bettor seeing around the 2016 US presidential election that Paddy Power may have paid out Hillary Clinton bets prior to election day. And then, of course, if that's more of a marketing ploy, it might be a slightly different dynamic there. But Adam, if we're talking about a scenario like this, is there any sort of statute of limitations? I mean, I'm talking about this now 4 days after the fact, so I like to think I'm in the clear with their grading. But I get that if within 24 or so hours something changes, then that might alleviate bettor's pushback on, well, I put this money in action or I made a quick withdrawal. I guess my final topic here, then we'll move on. What do you think in the way of a possible statute of limitations on a situation like this?
Yeah, I honestly think it's sort of the Sunday night. I get what happened on the Monday, and ultimately you got to pay the unders in that aspect, but I think you just got to let the overs go and eat it. You can't, 2 days down the road, it just gets complicated, and to me, it just puts a bad taste in anyone's mouth that ends up on the wrong side of it, and then ultimately just bad press. And while most of the books and operators aren't too worried about that because they just overcome it, and the news cycle's so quick these days that it's, kitty litter paper within 24 hours. It just doesn't matter. But I think ultimately that one is, for them to do it now, that's just bad ethics.
All right. Well, I appreciate you humoring me on this one. I know we gave it a bit of oxygen. I just feel like it might seem like such a rare scenario, but when you find yourself involved in it, I'd imagine on either side of the counter, it's really important to try to have a game plan as to how to best handle it. So hopefully this has been a useful thought exercise for those who were not directly involved in something like this recently. But Adam, at this point, if we want to shift gears from that tangled web of a recent NFL betting scenario to a cleaner slate on the hardwood, the NBA season now underway. 2 weeks ago, our look ahead segment focused on the NBA season ahead of tip-off. And when we talked futures, you said Prime's exposure was heavy on the favorites, Oklahoma City and Boston, as well as, surprisingly to you, a lot of New York money as well, with some action also coming in on teams like Sacramento and Golden State. So fast forwarding to this stage, as the book, Adam, how would you describe the top teams you're rooting for and maybe any top teams you're rooting against when it comes to futures exposure?
It's pretty much the same teams that we're looking at right now. I was just bringing up the chart to have a double check. Again, it's been a long time since the Knicks have been so short, for as long as I can remember. And it sort of stayed somewhat the same teams. We'll end up having 80% of the field running for us going through the course of the season. The early bets are ones that, again, people that have bankrolls want to have a position early, think that they see something that won't be there long. But futures on NBA and NHL, MLB, a little bit different because often those prices at the end of April aren't getting updated quick enough. So there's opportunities there. But you'll see that the first few weeks of a season, there's really not that many futures bets. It's sort of after, again, that 3 to 4 week period where books just aren't updating that stuff. But you're getting an idea of what might be a little bit different versus what the preseason odds were. And then ultimately that sort of builds out into, building up little positions. But Scott and I on Saturday night had Bill Krakenberger on, and he was talking about futures things. And I thought afterwards, a little bit different, probably has a really good bankroll, can put forth on that. But that 5 or 10,000 or whatever it was that he had on that futures bet, is that better put into play on a season-long bet, or is it taking that and churning it over in the regular season or day-to-day and things like that? So that's where, historically I was a big futures player. I had probably more than 50% of my bankroll out on futures at any given time. And, looking back on it was probably not the best way or best use of it, but I always thought that you could be underneath the radar, going to Vegas and that and betting baseball futures at All-Star break, NFL things, going there up in February and March for Kentucky Derby and the Masters and the golf, things like that. There was the opportunity to spend a small amount with big upside where you could really, if there's books that limit you, you can really take a shot at them by chipping away. Even examples of a Betfred 20 years ago, betting NHL and NBA futures. This was a place that would limit you $25 to $50 on anything. So if you could find a 50 or 60 to 1 shot, bet it literally every day for a month, it accumulates in that sense. And if it comes through, then you can sort of hit them in a good spot. So that's sort of the balance of that. For me, there was one, I think a couple of years ago, Buffalo Bills had gotten to 7-2 or 3-1 preseason. For me, it's just whack it up at 5s, 5.5, even 6s, get all the money you can in on it. Because ultimately, whatever you're holding on futures, chances are you're going to write more on a Super Bowl day, or at least with the NFL. I think we'd spoken about it previous as well, as knowing your risk going into the playoffs and then being able to build it week after week after week, knowing it's a knockout series. So ultimately, for me, futures is just take as much bets as you can, put up the liquidity. I'm going to be lower on the big prices, more aggressive on the favorites, because I think those all-ups just really aren't that much bigger once you get to playoff series and things like that, where you can really take all the liquidity that you build up and put yourself in a strong position.
Couple of gems right there when it comes to the bettor's point of view, the time utility of money, a different equation to each bettor depending on their approach and their bankroll, as well as on the booking side of things, how to handle futures exposure when you know you've got knockout rounds coming in a playoff and you can adjust accordingly. Adam, in addition to those nuggets, I want to call out that my favorite part of your insight 2 weeks ago when we talked NBA was your reference to meeting a basketball bettor in the 90s in Thailand who studied how the ball bounced on the backboard and the wood on different courts to find an edge. So for my fellow process nerds out there, what other NBA handicapping nuggets can you share from your decades of experience on both sides of the counter?
So a lot of it was the travel schedule as well. Back then they were using buses, now they're using jets. So there's a little bit of variance and difference in that. I definitely see it in other sports like the NFL where the travel, if they're going to the East Coast, they're traveling on a Wednesday instead of a Saturday and things like that. The whole leagues are just way more professional. But that was definitely one. Again, teams that were on the road defensively got weaker in like the second or third game, fourth games on the road. So the overs were often a big play. The refs, not highlighting the ref issues that they've had in the past. But definitely the refs, there was tendencies to be under refs, over refs, calling fouls in certain situations. Teams that they did like, teams that they didn't like, players that they did like, players that they didn't like. Again, they're human. It becomes a lot of personal aspect in this as well. But definitely the travel, having a late night, a game, a 10 p.m. game the night before, and then an early game with travel in between, things like that, were definitely things where they would look at the teams defensively not being as strong as what they were first game in the road and stuff like that. And then as it gets in, if they've got 4 or 5 on the road, they may settle and get comfortable and be good at the end of it. But there's definitely dynamics that are related to the travel, some of the time zone slips, again, a late game the night before, double overtimes, and then having to back up the next night. There's, different things that used to exist. How much of them exist today, I'm not 100% sure because I don't go into the depth on these particularly long season grinding sports. I'll sort of stick around and wait for the playoffs and get more involved then. But I guess there was one last night with Philadelphia where they pulled a player late and it went from 2.5 one side to 3 the other side, and the team that ended up favored, won by 100 or whatnot as well. So there's a lot of, they're grinding sports, but if you really stay on top of it, there's those opportunities. The other aspect is the live versus pregame. Why spend so many hours on the pregame when you can look at the live? Now, the dynamic, again, has changed a lot. For me, one of the first things I did when I moved to Jamaica, got this side, I was seeing who was making the second half lines. And sometimes he was in the corner talking, chatting up a girl, and then they'd call out a score, you'd run over, put in the number, and the shooting percentages were like 60% to the other team, 18%. So there was no real knowledge in what these numbers were. It was like, what was the closing line? What's the score? Things like that. So those dynamics and the professionalism of how these numbers are created based on really the live betting now becomes your literally already created second half line. But I think there's also opportunities there where you can watch games, you can see the flows, you can see the percentages, you can see which team may have been unlucky in the first half, and you expect that to sort of equal out in the second half. So that's where I would spend time, 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern time, just having as many games on as possible and waiting for those 1 or 2 nuggets where a team gets up big and that they have a natural instinct to sort of lay it down, and the numbers just aren't efficient in that way. So that's where I'd be sending it, and then sort of watching those percentages, whether a team's just shooting lights out, especially in like the first 5 minutes, that number can just get erratic in those aspects as well. And then also when the underdog kind of takes the lead early, and that can sort of skew with some numbers as well. You kind of, with the live, got to believe the models are made off historical data. So if you're in a situation in a game that doesn't happen that often, whether it's a big favorite and they're suddenly down, or it's a big favorite, there's certain aspects that you can identify numbers that don't happen a lot. Well, the models aren't built for that to have happened a lot. So that's where you can find some nuances where I believe that the eyeball can actually beat the models at times, because again, they're just using historical data. And if you get unique circumstances, whether it's certain players out, again, these models aren't player driven. They're generally just team driven and historical data. So I think that's the weakness in it. And that's where if you spend your time, you can sort of make it valuable to find some of those weaknesses, and discipline and patience, like leaning into those opportunities. And then the toughest one of all is when you lose, coming back and trusting your process and continuing on, because that's ultimately what makes the difference between the great and the good, is those ones that just, they know what they're doing, they trust the process, results are results, you have no real control over it, but you've got to fight through it. And that's where the bankroll management, which I have no skill at, never had that kind of bankroll management aspect to my game. That's where it's really, it's in between the two ears, ultimately, is how this is played out, and finding those spots that are weaknesses.
As you share that, I can't help but think back to some of my formative years as a bettor, reading the Point Blank column by the late, great David Malinsky. He would often talk about markets like in-game betting, where odds makers would be working off of a chart, basically taking pregame numbers, looking at current game state, some high-level metrics, and that's about it. So it's refreshing to hear that there are still some opportunities available to bettors who are attentive to some edges that may be hiding in plain sight. And Adam, earlier on, you also referenced late nights travel schedules also being a subtle nuance people can pick up on. And that brought to mind for me the notion of the Vegas flu, which kind of took on a life of its own once the Golden Knights came onto the scene in the NHL. So if we want to use that as an opportunity to swap the sneakers for states and talk some NHL, I know it's not long since the puck dropped on the hockey season. How's it going so far for you and the Prime team?
Actually, hockey hasn't been a lot of volume. It's really not. I think we're doing more on golf than we are on hockey at this point. It's an interesting sport. It's sort of, you're always sort of weighing up of the interest can wane and then suddenly it'll get popular. And I think that's often when there's nothing else on. It's kind of that fourth or fifth or sixth sport for most people, unless they're Canadian or Scandinavian, which obviously Prime doesn't operate in either of those jurisdictions. But for, true US bettors and that, the hockey's actually been very low. I was looking at the numbers again, pre and live, fairly well balanced. But yeah, it's oddly enough, I think even tennis, we were doing more volume than on the hockey. So it's really an odd sport. But when it comes to playoffs, and, I really like the hockey in the playoffs time, where it's, they play all season. The home ice doesn't mean as much as what some of the other sports are. While there has been adjustments for the books to kind of put that into consideration, I think there's still gaps. But yeah, it's an odd sport.
When you referenced that bettor you met back in Thailand in the 90s, I'll go to that again, just the nuances of really drilling on how does the ball bounce on different courts or off different backboards. In the NHL, have you ever come across anything where certain rinks might be faster than others, or the boards in certain arenas might be harder or softer than others, where there could be a bit of a parallel to maybe identifying some edges in hockey, similar to how one might approach basketball?
So I think there was the few small ones were often the rink size. I know when it come to the Olympic Games and international games, there was always conversations about rink sizes being different. I think some of the outside games that they played, they've spoken about the different rink sizes, which obviously can tend to the overs because there's more space for shots and things like that. It really wasn't a sport that I got into too much. As I said, loved the playoffs. They just seemed to have those, the favorites way too short in the series prices. And it always seemed like it was 1-1 after the first two games. So you could sort of bet that dog blindly before the series started. If you didn't win that game, just trust they'd win the second game, even though you had the negative EV at that point. But after two games, you had sort of the edge on that aspect. And from memory, a lot of dogs went up 2-0 or it was 1-1. It was rarely that you're in a hole in that spot. But even then, it was easy for him to come back. Very unlike the NBA, which generally the better team won. They went home, they won their games, they go on the road, they usually pick up one, and then they sort of close it out at home. Hockey was really just playoffs is when I got involved. And then futures, again, all-star breaks during the season. They aren't updated like they need to be, and you can really get some advantages. You see someone sort of gets a run in the points. I know, again, the divisions and that have all sort of changed over the last 5 or so years, but that's another aspect where the futures just aren't updated like they should be, and there's often some opportunities, where there's a 60 or 80 to 1 shot that should be 25s or 30s. Now, what is that worth over at the end of the season with putting the money up now and all those aspects? The value is if it's books that you're potentially going to get limited at over the course of time, taking those shots where you may get them for a proper amount and then, kill the account and move on.
Well, Adam, building on the fondness you've expressed for the hockey playoffs and the chaos they can provide, I know it's months out, but what noteworthy action have you seen thus far, even though the volume has been relatively low? Wondering if there's anything you've seen thus far that has started to influence your rooting interest as teams across the league pick up their pursuit of the Stanley Cup.
Again, the future's literally nothing. The fact that with New Jersey, we can't take any actions. It's like the Tigers. There is no action on the Red Wings. So, it's really inactive at this point in time. The other aspect of some of these futures as well is how the regulators tax it. Some of them tax it as a cash. So when you take that bet on a future, you're paying the tax on it at that point in time. Whereas some of them are sort of an accrual and accounting where you're doing it as you grade events. So an example for Ohio, you're paying your 20% on the dollar today of any bets that you're taking to win the Stanley Cup in May or June. So, there's really no point being aggressive on that stuff because they also have no rollover, which means if you happen to lose in that month, you'd already paid the tax on it and there's no money coming back. So that's sort of the balance of, we haven't really been aggressive on the futures, which was kind of one of my plans coming in because of this tax nuance. There's no point writing these bets, paying the 20% on it now, and then having to sort of wait 6-7 months for those results to come in and hope that it falls correctly. So, hockey is really something that we haven't pushed in that aspect. Whereas I think there's more NBA betting in general on the futures. People will take shots on certain teams. The hockey is really a difficult sport to get too excited about at this point in time, and really doesn't draw in the volume that even some of those lesser sports that you may think are across this landscape.
Well, Adam, I don't always drink beer, and when I do, I typically don't prefer Dos Equis, but next time they're casting for most interesting man in the world, this conversation is just the latest example why they should strongly consider you for that leading role. Thank you for another fascinating one-on-one conversation with the level of insight only you can bring to the table.
Great, Matt. Again, it's good to have just me and you on deck. Joe, brings a little noise to the entertainment at times. So, yeah, always good time.
Yes, and wishing Joe the best as he is on the mend. To the audience, want to thank you for tuning in this week as well. However you spent your Sports Equinox and whatever you prefer to pour into your glass, cheers to making us a part of your week, and we'll catch you next week right back here on Prime Suspects. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Prime Suspects. Register for Prime Sports at primesports.com and download the Prime Sports app. You can follow us on Twitter at Prime Sportsbook, at Joe Brennan Jr., and at Adam Bjorn 2. You must be 21 or over to play on Prime Sports. Always bet responsibly and within your limits. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER.